Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a big one. We're synthesizing a massive amount of information to give you a real conceptual roadmap for force management.
Yeah, it's a beast of a system.
It really is. It dictates how the Army organizes, equips, sustains itself. I mean, people often see it as just bureaucracy, right? Kind of impenetrable gray matter.
That's a good way to put it. But it's actually the engine that drives institutional change in the Army.
Okay, so our goal today.
Our mission, really, is to take these complex, often tangled processes, things that, look, many field-grade officers interact with daily, maybe without even fully realizing the whole picture, and distill it all down.
Into actionable knowledge.
Exactly. You need to understand this, not because you're necessarily going to become a functional Area 50 force management officer, probably not, but because this system, it creates and sustains every single organization, every piece of gear, every policy you will ever encounter.
So if you want to make a change, or even just understand why things are the way they are,
you have to know the rules of the road. You need to understand how the system works to effectively advocate within it.
we certainly had a hefty stack of reading for this one. We pulled from Change Management in the Army, Determining and Documenting Authorizations, and that really core text, Designing Army Units, an Introduction to Force Development.
Foundational stuff. And then on the sort of operational and systems side, we dove into material development and the acquisition system, force integration and resourcing, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. Huge processes there.
And finally, wrapping it all together, we synthesized guidance from Understanding Joint Capabilities, Integration and Development System, Guidance and Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Leadership and Education, Personnel, Facilities, and Policy. That's a mouthful.
Always is.
Yeah.
You have to say the whole thing, though.
You do. And also the principles from Continuous Transformation.
And when you look across all those, a pretty clear definition of force management starts to emerge. It's the Department of the Army's institutional process. Its job, managing fundamental change.
Balancing the future and the present.
That's the core tension. Balancing those anticipated future needs, what we think tomorrow's fight requires, against today's ongoing requirements, the immediate demands.
And it translates that high-level vision.
Right, the strategy into actual policies, and this is critical, resource programs, things with money and people attached.
All aimed at providing those land domain capabilities combatant commanders need, both now and in the long term.
Okay, so to give you a mental framework for this whole discussion, the sources really break force management down into 5 broad lines of effort. They're intertwined, often running at the same time, but thinking about them sequentially helps.
Okay, what are they?
First, you figure out what you need. That's capabilities development. Think of it as the needs analysis.
Step 1, then.
Step 2, design the solution. That's force development. How do we build the organization to meet the need? It's actually a process within the larger process.
Okay. Need identified, organization designed. Then we get the tools.
Exactly. Material development. That's the whole system for acquiring the equipment, the gear.
Step 4 must be putting it all together.
You got it. Force integration. The synchronization piece, making sure all the parts, doctrine, people, training, equipment actually come together coherently in the field.
And finally, the bottom line.
Resourcing, paying for it all. Money, people, the whole planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system fits here.
Capabilities development, force development, material development, force integration, and resourcing. Got it.
Those 5 lines really cover the entire life cycle of organizational change in the Army. So let's start at the absolute beginning. Why does the Army always need to change? And what are the legal authorities that shape how it can change?
Right, the constant need for change. I mean, the military doesn't operate in a vacuum, does it? The world changes, threats change. So institutional change isn't optional, it's mandatory.
Absolutely. General Randy George, the current Chief of Staff, talks about this constantly. Continuous transformation. It's about iteratively adapting, evolving how the Army fights, how it organizes, trains, equips, everything.
It's not a one-and-done deal.
No way. The goal is constant adaptation because, guess what? Our adversaries are doing the same thing. They're continuously transforming too. We have to stay ahead.
And history really backs this up. Requirements aren't static. Think about the shift after September 11th.
Oh, absolutely. A massive pivot. The Army had Cold War structures, conventional priorities. Then suddenly the overwhelming demand was counterinsurgency, stability operations, things that required a fundamentally different force design and resource allocation.
It shows requirements have to be flexible, ready to respond to real-world events, even if that throws years of planning out the window.
Exactly. Planning is essential, but the plan must adapt to reality.
But the Army can't just change on a whim. It operates within a specific legal framework, starting with the U.S. Constitution and the separation of powers.
This is bedrock. Seems basic, maybe, but the division of labor between the President and Congress regarding the military is absolutely crucial for understanding force management.
Okay, break that down.
So the President is the commander-in-chief, directs the day-to-day operations, employs the forces, sends them into combat. That's the executive function.
But Congress holds the purse strings and writes the rules.
Precisely.
Okay.
Congress has the explicit constitutional authority to raise armies, to maintain a navy, to legislate the detailed organization of the military, how it's structured, and, crucially, to determine the funding. That funding power is the ultimate oversight mechanism.
So there's always this inherent tension, the president's operational needs versus Congress's structural and financial constraints.
Always. It's a constant balancing act baked into the system.
This legislative authority is codified in the United States Federal Code. Which specific titles are most relevant here?
Title 10 is the big one for us. It outlines the general organization and mission of the entire Department of Defense. And Subtitle B is specifically about the Army. This is where the institutional Army's duties are defined.
Not just Title 10, though.
Right. Title 32 is also vital for the Army because it governs the National Guard when they're under state control, under the governor. That impacts how we design, fund, and integrate the reserve components before they're federalized.
And Title 50.
Title 50 covers broader war and national defense issues, often deals with intelligence, special authorities, things like that. But Title 10 is really the heartland for force management.
Okay, so Title 10 defines the Army's mission. If the President, via the Secretary of Defense, directs combat ops, what exactly is the Department of the Army's Title 10 mission, according to our sources?
Yeah, this is a key distinction. The Secretary of the Army's role, their Title 10 responsibility, is not commanding units in combat.
It's providing the capabilities.
Exactly. Providing the land domain capabilities needed by the combatant commanders. Title 10 spells out 12 specific responsibilities for the Secretary of the Army.
Things like recruiting, organizing,
Supplying, equipping, training, maintaining, all those foundational institutional tasks. Basically, the Department of the Army is this enormous enterprise responsible for generating and sustaining land power. It builds and maintains the machine that the combatant commanders then employ.
And to manage this huge enterprise, the Department of the Army structure has that split at the very top, at headquarters, Department of the Army.
Right. Two main parts. You've got the Secretariat, led by the Secretary of the Army. They focus on the high-level policy, the oversight, the civilian control aspect.
And then the Army staff.
Led by the Chief of Staff and the Vice Chief. They handle the detailed execution, the planning, the resourcing. They're the military professionals translating policy into action.
But there's that interesting limitation Congress put in place, the staff size.
Yeah, it's legally capped. The Army staff itself can't exceed 3,105 personnel.
Which seems small for managing an army of over 1 million people globally.
It is. And that limitation forces delegation. There's no way 3,100 people can execute all those detailed Title 10 functions.
So they push the work down to subordinate activities.
Exactly. Four main types. You have the big Army commands, like Forces Command, Training and Doctrine Command, Army Materiel Command, Army Futures Command. They do the heavy lifting. Then the Army Service Component commands assigned to each combatant commander, plus direct reporting units and field operating agencies.
And these organizations are the ones actually doing the bulk of the Title 10 work, the training, the developing, the sustaining.
That's right. They are the operational arms of the institutional Army.
This structure directly leads to a really critical concept, administrative control, or ADCON. Every field-grade officer needs to get this.
Absolutely critical. Administrative control is the authority the Service Secretary, in our case the Secretary of the Army, uses to fulfill those Title 10 responsibilities we just talked about.
Organizing, resources, personnel.
Training standards, discipline, logistic support. It's the administrative lifeline connecting a soldier or a unit back to the Department of the Army, back to its service.
Okay, but here's the crucial point, the one that trips people up. Administrative control is not a command relationship. It's separate from operational command.
This is fundamental. Let's use that deployment example. It makes it clearer. Imagine an infantry brigade combat team from, say, the 101st Airborne Division deploys to Africa. They fall under a joint task force commanded by, let's say, a Marine general.
Okay, so the operational chain of command, OPCON, goes President, Secretary of Defense, Combatant Commander, Marine General, down to the Army Brigade Combat Team Commander. Clear line for missions.
Crystal clear for operations. The Marine General tells the brigade combat team where to go and what to do operationally.
But who handles their Army-specific stuff? Replacements, equipment, pay?
That's administrative control. That brigade combat team still belongs to the Army administratively. If they need replacement soldiers, spare parts for their Army vehicles, Army-specific training materials, they don't go to the Marine General.
They go back through Army channels.
They go to the Army Service Component Command assigned to that geographic combatant command. That Army Service Component Command, using its administrative control authority delegated from the Secretary of the Army, provides those personnel, parts, and sustainment. The Marine General doesn't organize their personnel system, doesn't manage their specific equipment maintenance, doesn't handle their Army schools.
That's the Army's Title X job, executed via administrative control. Two distinct lines of authority and support running to the same unit.
Exactly. Understanding who provides what through which channel is vital for any deployed unit.
Now, coordinating all this high-level policy and institutional change across the entire Army requires some kind of master plan. That's the Army Strategic Planning System, right?
Yes, the Army Strategic Planning System is the framework that integrates all the Army's Title X execution with national strategy. It ensures alignment.
It nests within bigger documents like the National Security Strategy.
Absolutely. It flows down from the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Defense Planning Guidance. It makes sure Army plans support national objectives. It has four main parts.
Okay, what are they?
First, the Army Strategy. That's the long-term vision, where the Army needs to go over decades. Second, the Army Campaign Plan, which outlines how the Army intends to achieve that strategy over the medium term.
Then it gets more specific.
Right. Third is the Army Planning Guidance. This translates the strategy into prioritized objectives for the near term, guiding the force development and resourcing efforts. And fourth, the Army Program Guidance Memorandum.
And that one tells people how to build the budget.
Essentially, yes. It issues specific programming instructions to the resource management community, telling them how to build the upcoming Program Objective Memorandum, which is the Army's formal budget request to the Department of Defense. The whole system ensures strategy drives resources.
Okay, that sets a solid foundation. We see the need for change, the legal constraints, the structure, and the top-level planning. Now, let's dive into step one of the actual force management process. How do we figure out what capabilities we need in the first place?
Right, figuring out what is needed. The Department of Defense-wide system for this is the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. You'll hear it called JCADS.
JCADS, okay. And this is the standardized way all the services identify and validate requirements?
Yes, it's the overarching decisions support system. It's meant to ensure joint interoperability and prevent unnecessary duplication across the services.
What's interesting is that this whole requirements process isn't just about bean counting. It's driven by ideas, by concepts.
Absolutely central. Concepts like the Army warfighting concept, which gets updated periodically, are the intellectual starting point. They translate that broad strategy we just talked about into specific required capabilities.
How do they do that?
By looking ahead. They assess the future operational environment, likely threats, technological trends, and then describe how the Army intends to fight and win in that future context. These aren't just dreamed up. They're refined through war games, experiments, detailed analysis.
So the concepts provide the why and how that drives the what.
Perfectly put. And those concepts then feed directly into the formal capabilities-based assessment process. This is the structured, deliberate method the Army uses to analyze what it needs and identify where the gaps are.
Deliberate process. Okay, it has specific steps.
3 key steps, very structured.
Yeah.
Step 1 is the needs analysis.
Okay, what happens there?
This is where planners dig into those concepts and strategies and identify the specific required capabilities. What operational tasks does the Army need to perform? Under what conditions? To what measurable standard? It answers the basic question. Based on how we plan to fight, what must we be able to do?
And the output is a list of required capabilities.
A very clear list. Then comes step 2, the reality check, the gap analysis.
Where you compare what you need with what you actually have.
Exactly, and what you're programmed to get in the near future. Planners identify the shortfalls, the gaps between the required capabilities from the needs analysis and the current or programmed force.
But it's not just listing gaps, right? It's about risk.
Critically important. You have to prioritize the gaps based on the risk they pose, risk to mission success, or risk to the safety of the force. Since you can never afford to fill every single gap, this prioritization is absolutely essential. Which gaps are truly dangerous?
Makes sense. Needs gaps. Then step 3 must be finding solutions.
The solutions analysis. This step explores how to mitigate those high-priority gaps identified in the gap analysis.
Looking at different options.
Yes. Critically, it looks at both non-material solutions, changes to doctrine, organization, training, policy, and material solutions, meaning new equipment.
And any proposed solution has to pass certain tests.
3 key tests.
Oh.
It has to be strategically responsive, meaning it actually addresses the need. It has to be feasible technologically, logistically possible, and it has to be realizable. Can we actually afford it, acquire it, sustain it within a reasonable time frame?
If it fails any of those, it's not a real solution.
Correct. It's just a wish list item.
Now, when we talk about a capability, the sources hammer this home. We have to think broadly. It's not just about the M for material. We need that full acronym.
Doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership and education, personnel, facilities, and policy, DOTMLPFP-P.
Why is using the full framework so vital?
Because a true capability only exists when all those domains converge. You can field the best tank in the world, material, but if you don't update your tactics, doctrine, create the right maintenance structure, organization, train the crews and maintainers, training, develop leaders who understand its use, leadership and education, assign enough people, personnel, build the necessary ranges and depots, facilities, and set the right policies for its employment, policy.
Then you don't actually have the capability, you just have an expensive piece of equipment sitting somewhere.
Exactly. Focusing only on the material piece almost guarantees failure because you haven't addressed the institutional support structure required to make it effective.
And there's a definite priority in how solutions are considered, right? Non-material first.
Almost always. Changes to doctrine, organization, training, personnel assignments, policy, these are generally faster and cheaper than developing and fielding major new equipment systems. So the process mandates you look at non-material fixes first. Can we solve this gap without buying something new and expensive?
Okay, so the capabilities-based assessment is done. A solution is identified. How is this formally documented?
2 primary ways. If the solution is primarily non-material or involves only minor material changes, maybe just increasing the quantity of existing gear, what they sometimes call little m material, the output document, is a doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership and education, personnel, facilities, and policy change request, a DCR.
And for many officers, especially at centers of excellence or on operational staffs, writing or reviewing these DCRs is where they directly touch force management.
That's a really important point for listeners. This is often your entry point. You see a problem, a gap in your unit or your branch's capability. Documenting it in a well-reasoned DCR is how you propose a fix and get it into the formal system.
Okay, so DCRs for non-material or minor material. What if the solution requires a major new piece of kit, the big M material?
Then the starting point is usually an initial capabilities document, or ICD.
This kicks off the formal acquisition process.
It does. The initial capabilities document describes what capability is needed, the performance attributes required, the operational context. But, and this is key, it deliberately avoids specifying how to build it. It defines the problem, not the specific technical solution.
Why that distinction?
To keep the requirements generation process, what we need, separate from the acquisition process, how we get it, industry needs flexibility to propose innovative solutions. The initial capabilities document sets the requirements boundary.
Before these DCRs or ICDs go forward to the joint level, like the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, they face an internal Army hurdle first.
Yes, the Army Requirements Oversight Council, or AROC. This is the Army's internal gatekeeper, managed by the Headquarters, Department of the Army G8 staff.
What's its role?
It advises the Chief of Staff and the Vice Chief on prioritizing and integrating these proposed capability documents across all those DOT, ML, PFET domains. It acts as a critical filter.
Making sure it aligns with Army strategy and that the Army is willing to accept the resource implications.
Exactly. It ensures synchronization with the Army's overall plans and that senior leaders have explicitly reviewed the proposal and accepted any associated risks or trade-offs before it goes forward for potential joint validation.
Okay, so the need is identified, the requirement is documented and validated internally. Now we get into actually designing the specific solution, the organization, and the material.
Right. Designing the nuts and bolts. Let's start with the organizational design piece, which is formally called force development.
And this isn't typically done by dedicated force management officers.
Mostly not. The heavy lifting drafting the blueprints for new or modified units is usually done by the branch subject matter experts. Think about the folks at the Capability Development and Integration Directorates, the CDIDs, located within the various centers of excellence.
The infantry experts design infantry units. The intel experts design intel units.
Exactly. They have the deep operational and technical knowledge for their specific branch or function. They're the ones figuring out how a future maneuver battalion or a cyber protection team should be structured.
And the main tool they use to propose these changes is the Force Design Update, or FDU.
That's the primary staff packet, yes. It's a comprehensive document.
What are the key parts of a Force Design Update?
Well, there's the organizational design and assessment concept paper that describes the unit's concept, its mission, how it's structured. But arguably the most critical and most contentious part is the build strategy.
Ah, yes, the zero-sum game. Because the Army can't just grow indefinitely due to congressionally mandated end strength limits.
Precisely. If you want to stand up a new unit or even just significantly increase the size of an existing type of unit, you have to identify where those personnel authorizations, the spaces, are going to come from.
Which means identifying another unit or type of unit that will be inactivated or reduced to free up those authorizations.
It's pure trade-off. And that's why force design updates are such high-stakes documents internally. Proposing a new capability inherently means proposing to take resources away from an existing one. It generates enormous friction.
What else is in the Force Design Update?
It also includes the rules of allocation. These are essentially quantitative doctrine. They define how many units of a particular type are needed based on various planning factors, and they're used by the Center for Army Analysis in their modeling efforts to figure out the optimal force mix and alignment globally.
So the Force Design Update proposes the ideal structure. But that leads to the important distinction between a requirement and an authorization.
Crucial distinction. The Table of Organization and Equipment, the TOE, represents the requirement. It's the doctrinal blueprint. It outlines the minimum essential personnel and equipment needed for that unit type to accomplish its core mission without taking on undue risk. It's the should-be state.
But reality intervenes.
Always. Resources are scarce: personnel, money, equipment availability. So the Army has to accept risk. The document that reflects the actual resource structure, what the Army will field, is the Modified Table of Organization and Equipment, the MTOE.
That's the authorization document?
Yes. The MTOE is tailored based on resource constraints identified during later processes like total Army analysis, which we'll get to. It reflects the reality of what the Army can actually afford to man, equip, and sustain at a given point in time.
So the TOE might say an engineer company needs 10 bulldozers, but the MTOE for a specific unit might only authorize 8 because that's all the Army bought or can maintain.
Exactly. The MTOE is where the doctrinal ideal meets the resource reality.
Okay, that covers the organizational design. Now let's shift to the other side, getting the equipment, the material solution. This is governed by the Defense Acquisition System.
Right, the DACE. This is the Department of Defense-wide process for developing and acquiring material. It's complex because it has to comply with a whole raft of federal laws and regulations about government procurement.
And it often gets criticized for being slow and bureaucratic.
It does, and sometimes that criticism is fair for the big, complex programs. But the sources emphasize it's actually more adaptable now. It offers 6 different acquisition pathways.
To allow for different speeds and risk levels?
Exactly. The traditional path is major capabilities acquisition. That's the methodical, deliberate, often very long process for developing major systems like a new tank or helicopter. It prioritizes reducing risk, but takes time.
But there are faster options for urgent needs.
Yes. Recognizing the need for speed, especially based on recent operational experience, there's urgent capabilities acquisition. This is designed to field solutions in less than 2 years to meet immediate, often unforeseen operational needs discovered in combat.
Higher risk, faster delivery.
Correct. And then there's middle-tier acquisition, MTA. This pathway aims for rapid prototyping or rapid fielding within 5 years. It explicitly accepts more technical risk to get capabilities out faster than the traditional major capabilities acquisition route. This is increasingly important for staying ahead of technological curves.
Okay, let's walk through the phases of the big one, major capability acquisition, since it's the foundation. It starts after that initial capabilities document is approved.
Right. The formal entry point into the acquisition system is the Material Development Decision, or MDD. This decision approves the need identified in the initial capabilities document and kicks off the first major analytical step, the analysis of alternatives, or AOA.
Analyzing different ways to solve the problem.
Yes. The acquisition community rigorously assesses various competing material approaches to fill that capability gap defined in the initial capabilities document.
Could it be an upgrade to an existing system, brand new design, an off-the-shelf purchase?
And the results of that analysis of alternatives feed into the first official phase, material solution analysis, MSA.
Correct. Phase 1, material solution analysis, is largely a paper study phase, refining the chosen concept from the analysis of alternatives, doing initial systems engineering, translating the capability gap into preliminary system requirements. It concludes with a decision point called Milestone A.
Milestone A approves the concept.
Yes, the Milestone Decision Authority reviews the work done in material solution analysis and, if approved, releases funding for the next, more intensive phase, which is Phase 2. Technology maturation and risk reduction, or TMRR. Sounds expensive.
It definitely is. This is where you often see competitive prototyping. Companies build actual hardware or software prototypes to demonstrate that the proposed technology is mature enough, affordable, militarily useful, and stable enough to proceed into full-scale development. Risk reduction is key here.
And during this phase, the requirements get refined further.
Yes, the capability developer takes the initial requirements from the initial capabilities document and develops the much more detailed capabilities development document, or CDD. This specifies the detailed key performance parameters, the KPPs, and other technical attributes the final system absolutely must meet.
And TMRR culminates in another huge decision, Milestone B.
Milestone B is arguably the most significant decision point in the entire acquisition process.
Why is that? Because of the funding commitment.
Exactly. Successfully passing Milestone B grants the program official program of record status. This means it's formally approved for entry into the engineering and development phase, and critically, it receives funding approval across multiple years in the Future Years Defense Program, the FYDP. We're talking potentially billions of dollars committed at Milestone B.
So once a program hits Milestone B, the Department of Defense is making a major long-term financial bet.
A very major bet. That's why the scrutiny is so intense.
Okay, money secured, program of record status achieved. We enter Phase 3, Engineering and Manufacturing Development, or EMD.
The goal here is clear. Develop, build, and rigorously test a production representative prototype. You're finalizing the design, proving it works in realistic conditions, and confirming not just technical viability, but also that the manufacturing strategy is sound. Can we actually build this thing efficiently and reliably in large quantities?
And this phase leads to Milestone C.
Yes. Milestone C reviews the results of engineering and manufacturing development testing and, if successful, authorizes the program to actually begin producing systems for fielding.
Which brings us to Phase 4, Production and Deployment, or P&D. Finally, getting equipment to the troops.
Finally, this phase usually starts with low-rate initial production, or LRIP, building a small number of systems first to work out any kinks in the manufacturing process and conduct initial operational testing. If that goes well, it moves to full-rate production to build the total quantity needed.
Leading eventually to Initial Operational Capability, IOC, the first units having enough gear and trained people to employ it, and ultimately Fully Operational Capability, FOC.
Correct. And then comes the phase everyone forgets but pays for the longest. Phase 5, Operations and Sustainment, or ONS.
The long tail.
The very long and often most expensive tail. For major systems, this phase can easily last 30-40 years or more. It covers everything needed to keep the system operating. Maintenance, spare parts, software upgrades, logistics support, training updates, all the way through to eventual disposal.
And decisions made way back in technology maturation and risk reduction or engineering and manufacturing development have huge cost implications decades later in operations and sustainment.
Huge. Designing for sustainability and lower life cycle cost is critical, though sometimes sacrificed for upfront performance.
Okay, so that's how the equipment gets developed and produced. How does the Army determine exactly how many to buy and which specific units get them?
That's the job of the Basis of Issue Plan, or BOIP. This is the critical documentation that links a specific piece of equipment, identified by its line item number, or LIN, to specific tables of organization and equipment.
So it connects the acquisition system to the force structure documents.
Precisely. The Basis of Issue Plan determines the Army Acquisition Objective, or AAO, the total number of systems the Army needs to procure to meet the requirements outlined in all the relevant tables of organization and equipment. It also dictates the distribution logic.
The source material had a great example with the M41 protective mass test kit.
Yeah, that was illustrative. Analysts found this test kit was authorized in the Basis of Issue Plan, down to the company level across the entire Army. But when they looked at actual usage and need, They realized it was only truly essential at the battalion level in most cases.
So just by changing that authorization level in the basis of issue plan.
They drastically reduced the Army acquisition objective, the total number needed, saved something like $30 million in procurement and future sustainment costs just by refining that one basis of issue plan entry. It shows how powerful these detailed authorization documents are.
And throughout this whole design process, both organizational and material, there's an ongoing check happening, the force integration functional area analysis.
Yes, this is a continuous cross-check. As designs mature, the force integration experts across all the different domains, personnel, logistics, training, facilities, etc., are constantly assessing. Is this proposed solution suitable? Is it feasible? Is it acceptable? Can we actually integrate this new unit or new piece of equipment into the existing Army infrastructure without causing major unforeseen problems elsewhere? It's a vital reality check throughout the design phase.
Okay, so we've got requirements identified and validated, and we have potential designs for organizations and equipment, but none of that matters without actual authorizations and, critically, funding. This brings us to total Army analysis, or TAA.
TAA. This is often called the Super Bowl of force management within the Army, and for good reason.
Why is that? High stakes.
Extremely high stakes.
Right.
Total Army analysis is this massive iterative analysis process. It's all about risk versus benefit, making incredibly difficult trade-offs to determine the final authorized force structure, the capabilities the Army will actually resource and build.
This is where the doctrinal requirements from the tables of organization and equipment meet the hard limits of budget and personnel.
Exactly. It's the crucial bridge that moves the whole planning, programming, budgeting, and execution process, PPBE, out of the conceptual planning phase and into the concrete programming phase, where real dollars and authorizations get assigned.
And the overriding constraint here is that force structure size limit we talked about earlier, the end strength cap.
That's the fundamental constraint Total Army analysis operates within. It's primarily focused on optimizing the mix of capabilities within the existing legally mandated force structure size. That bill-payer strategy we mentioned in force design updates, this is where it gets adjudicated on a massive scale.
So if analysis shows a need for growth in one area, like cyber or long-range fires,
That growth absolutely must be paid for by corresponding reductions or inactivations elsewhere in the force. It forces incredibly tough choices about which capabilities are most critical for the future versus which legacy capabilities can be reduced or eliminated. It is a zero-sum game within the overall structure size.
total Army analysis happens in phases, right? Starting with quantitative modeling.
Yes, three main phases. Phase I is the quantitative analysis, sometimes called the capability demand analysis. This phase tries to be as objective and data-driven as possible.
Using computer models.
Sophisticated models run by the experts at the Center for Army Analysis. They use things like the Joint Integrated Contingency Model to simulate combat scenarios, maybe the Army's worst day scenario against a major adversary, and the Force Generation Model to calculate the required support structure.
And they use those rules of allocation from the force design updates.
Exactly. The models crunch the numbers based on various scenarios and those quantitative rules of allocation to calculate the mathematically optimal mix of operating force capabilities, the brigades, battalions, companies needed to meet the threats. The output is a quantified demand signal for force structure.
What about the generating force? The training bases, depots, headquarters units documented on tables of distribution and allowance? How are their requirements handled?
Their requirements are handled slightly differently in Phase 1. It's less about combat modeling and more about evaluating specific change management plans submitted by those institutional organizations. These are reviewed based on mission criticality, resource availability, and senior leader guidance, leading to a prioritized list of generating force demands. But ultimately, these demands have to be merged with the operating force demands for resourcing.
Which brings us to Phase 2, qualitative analysis and resourcing. The human element comes back in.
Big time. Phase 2 is where the human-in-the-loop analysis happens. Senior leaders and subject matter experts take the quantified demands from Phase 1 and make the hard decisions about which capabilities will actually be resourced to produce the final, approved program objective memorandum force. This is the force structure the Army will actually build and request funding for.
This sounds like where the really tough debates happen.
Absolutely. You have organizational integrator panels reviewing the demands, comparing competing priorities. There are multi-day resourcing conferences, often involving very senior general officers hashing out the trade-offs. It gets contentious because resources are always limited.
Can you give an example of a trade-off they might grapple with?
Sure. Let's say the Phase I models demand 3 new active component cyber battalions to meet a critical future threat. But based on budget projections and personnel constraints, the Army can maybe only afford to resource one fully right now.
So what are the options?
They have to decide. Do we resource that one cyber battalion fully, accepting risk in other areas? Do we try to create 3 understrength battalions, accepting risk in cyber capability itself? Do we shift resources from the National Guard or Reserve to fund the active unit, accepting risk in the reserve component's readiness? Or do we maybe fund one active and resource the other 2 in the Guard, accepting integration challenges?
These are fundamental decisions about where to accept risk.
Exactly. Senior leaders use their military judgment, weigh the strategic priorities, and make the call. This phase merges the operating force and generating force demands and hammers out the final resourced program objective memorandum force structure.
Okay. Demands analyzed, resources allocated. Phase 3 is synchronization.
Yes, the force synchronization review. This phase looks at the sequencing of all the approved changes. You can't just flip a switch and activate a new brigade.
Right. You need facilities built, equipment delivered, personnel assigned, units deactivated to free up spaces.
All of that has to be carefully choreographed over time to minimize disruption and readiness impacts. The Force Integration Functional Area Owners at Headquarters, Department of the Army G357, track all these dependencies, making sure, for example, that the barracks are ready before the soldiers arrive or the new tanks show up before the unit goes to the National Training Center. Synchronization is key to smooth execution.
And the major outputs of this whole total Army analysis process. We have the Program Objective Memorandum Force, which justifies the budget request.
Right. And then the Army Structure Memorandum, or RSTRIC. This is the official directive, the historical record published by G357, detailing all the approved force structure, decision activations, inactivations, conversions, down to the specific unit identification code level for all Army components, active, Guard, Reserve.
That's the authoritative document.
It is. And following that, the annual command plan process takes those Army Structure Memorandum decisions, resolves any lingering discrepancies or implementation issues with the major commands, and ultimately results in the publication of the final official modified tables of organization and equipment and tables of distribution and allowance documents that legally govern every single unit in the Army.
Wow, that's a huge analytical and decision-making cycle.
Mhm.
And it all operates within the even larger Department of Defense resource management system. Planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, or PPBE.
Yes, PPBE is the overarching framework the entire Department of Defense uses to align strategy with resources. It's mandated by law.
And it's not strictly sequential, right? It's overlapping cycles.
Very much so. It's concurrent, overlapping, and iterative. At any given time, the Army is planning 2 to 20 years out into the future, programming specific resources for the next 1 to 7 future years defense program, or FYDP budgeting in detail for the very next fiscal year, and simultaneously executing funds appropriated by Congress over the last several years. Some appropriations last up to 5 years.
It's a continuous churn.
A constant churn, trying to balance long-term vision with near-term execution.
The programming phase seems like where total Army analysis really plugs in and where the costs get locked into that future year's defense program.
That's the heart of it. Within the Army staff, you have Program Evaluation Groups, or PEGs. Each PEG is responsible for a major resource category like manning, equipping, training, sustaining. They act as portfolio managers.
And they use specific tools to track the money.
Yes, they manage resources using Management Decision Execution Packages, or MDEPs. Think of an MDEP as a specific bank account or funding line dedicated to a particular program or capability. It tracks the associated costs, quantities, and phasing across all the years of the future year's defense program.
So the MDEPs allow the PEGs to build, defend, and manage their portion of the Army's budget request.
Exactly. They ensure the Army submits a coherent, balanced, and affordable program to the Office of the Secretary of Defense as part of the overall Department of Defense budget build.
But the best-laid plans of PPBE often run into a major, real-world obstacle: the budget execution, specifically the issue of continuing resolutions.
CRs. The bane of program managers everywhere. Unfortunately, Congress passing temporary continuing resolutions instead of full appropriations bills on time has become almost the norm rather than the exception in recent years.
And that causes major disruptions.
Huge disruptions. It delays the obligation of funds, often for months into the fiscal year. While the Department of Defense has workarounds, the Government Accountability Office has documented that dealing with CRs consumes enormous amounts of time and effort that could be better spent elsewhere.
And critically, CRs often restrict new starts, right?
That's a killer. Under a continuing resolution, agencies usually can't start new programs or significantly ramp up production rates for existing ones. So a program that successfully navigated the whole acquisition process, got Milestone B approval, and is ready to enter production might get stalled for months, simply because the final budget isn't approved. It injects massive uncertainty and inefficiency into the carefully synchronized plans coming out of total Army analysis and the acquisition system.
Okay, so after all that planning, designing, analyzing, and budgeting, we finally have an approved plan, the authorizations are set, and hopefully the money is flowing. Now comes the final phase, actually making the change happen on the ground, force integration.
Exactly. Forced integration is where the plan meets reality. It's the synchronized, resource-constrained execution of those approved plans. It's about bringing all the pieces together, the new structure, the right personnel, the necessary training, the new equipment, the updated doctrine, in an orderly way to deliver combat-ready capabilities to the force.
It's the enabling process that makes the whole system deliver.
It is.
Yeah.
And there are specific force integration functional areas, 9 of them I believe, that are tracked meticulously to ensure all aspects are considered and synchronized. Things like personnel fill, equipment fielding, facilities construction, training readiness, they all have to line up.
And the Army uses specific tools to prioritize and manage this complex integration effort, aligning it with strategic goals. You mentioned the Army Modernization Priority List and the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List.
Right. Think of them as a hierarchy of prioritization. The Army Modernization Priority List, or APL, sets the broad strategic direction. It establishes the Army's top modernization priorities over the long term, across multiple budget cycles. It signals what's most important for the future force.
And the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List gets more granular.
Much more granular. The Dynamic Army Resource Priority List, or DARPL, is the operational tool. It provides a detailed, prioritized ranking of nearly every unit in the Army, down to the individual unit identification cane, or UIC level. There are about 7,500 UICs on it.
And that DARPL score directly impacts a unit.
Directly and significantly. A unit's position on the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List influences its priority for receiving new equipment, its authorized personnel fill level, its funding for training, and even its scheduling for major exercises or modernization events. It's the mechanism that translates strategic priorities into resource allocation at the unit level.
Okay, so that detailed prioritization on the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List connects directly to the Army's force generation model, the Regionally Aligned Readiness and Modernization Model, or RERM.
Yes, they work hand in hand. RERMM is the model the Army uses to manage the readiness cycles of its units, aiming to provide more predictability and balance for soldiers and families.
Predictable periods for different things?
That's the intent. Dedicated phases within the cycle for being on mission, for collective training, and importantly, for protected modernization. The goal is to reduce the stress of constant back-to-back deployments and create predictable windows when units are actually available and ready to receive new equipment, conduct new training, or reorganize according to approved force design updates.
So RERM synchronizes unit availability with the institution's need to implement changes.
Exactly. The different phases of RERM allow for long-term planning and ensure that key institutional forums, like the big Army Modernization and Equipping Conference, can align their decisions with when units are actually in their modernization window and available to execute those changes.
Let's try to tie those pieces together with an example. How would a unit experience the interplay of the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List, RERM, and maybe personnel manning?
Okay, good idea. Let's say we have a sustainment battalion. According to the long-range plan, it's scheduled to receive a major upgrade to its communication systems. As that battalion enters its scheduled modernization phase within its RERM cycle.
It becomes available for the upgrade.
Right. Its status changes. Because it's now protected and designated for modernization, its priority score on the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List likely increases significantly for that period.
And that higher DARPL score triggers other actions.
It does. The personnel managers at Headquarters Department of the Army G1 see that higher priority. Using the active component manning guidance, which prioritizes personnel fill based on DARPL categories, they might bump that sustainment battalion's authorized manning level up. Maybe goes from Category B, say 85% filled, to Category A, aiming for 100% fill, to ensure they have enough people to conduct the new equipment training and integration.
So the unit commander sees more soldiers arriving, and the new radios show up on schedule, all driven by these interconnected prioritization and scheduling systems.
That's the goal. It shows how force management decisions made years earlier eventually translate into tangible resources and actions at the unit level, synchronized through ReRM and prioritized by the DAR-PL. That's integration in action.
That makes it much clearer. A huge piece of integration is obviously people. We need to be really clear on the difference between manpower management and personnel management.
Yes, distinct functions, often confused. Manpower management is typically a G3 operations function. They manage the spaces, the documented requirements for personnel listed on the authorized modified tables of organization and equipment, or tables of distribution and allowance. They determine how many positions of each skill are needed in the force structure.
And personnel management.
That's a G1 personnel function. They manage the faces, the actual inventory of soldiers, the human beings available to fill those documented spaces.
And the challenge is there are almost never enough faces to perfectly fill all the authorized spaces.
Almost never, which necessitates prioritization. That's where the active component manning guidance comes in again. Since you can't fill every unit to 100%, this guidance directs the G1 on how to distribute the available personnel based on unit priority, often linked to the DAR-PL category and upcoming missions.
So Category A units, maybe early deployers or units undergoing critical modernization, get the highest fill priority.
Right. While Category C units, perhaps support units or those later in their readiness cycle, might be authorized a lower percentage fill. It's about managing personnel scarcity against mission requirements. And overall, the total number of soldiers has to be managed to meet the congressionally mandated end strength, carefully balancing the operating strength of soldiers available for units with the vital account for trainees, transients, holdees, and students, the TTHS account.
Okay, that's manning. What about distributing the actual equipment?
The primary organization responsible here is Army Materiel Command, which serves as the Army's lead material integrator, or LMI.
How do they track everything and make decisions?
They use a powerful web-based tool called the Decision Support Tool, or DST. This system provides the authoritative common operating picture for visualizing equipment inventory, shortages, and locations across the entire Army. It uses sophisticated algorithms to recommend sourcing solutions, how to best fill unit shortages by cross-leveling equipment, prioritizing based on DAR-PL scores and ReRM status.
And major strategic equipping issues get elevated.
Yes, the really complex or contentious equipping decisions, maybe involving trade-offs between major commands or components, are typically addressed at the semi-annual Army Modernization and Equipping Conference, or AMECE. This brings senior leaders together to synchronize and resolve strategic equipping challenges.
Finally, let's circle back to that idea of continuous transformation. The Transform in Contact initiative seems like the Army formally embracing a faster, maybe riskier way of doing force management.
That's a good way to characterize it. Transforming Contact is about accelerating change, often using those urgent and emergent requirements pathways we discussed earlier.
Bypassing some of the deliberate steps.
Sometimes, yes. It involves fielding new equipment or even experimental organizational designs much faster than the traditional deliberate process would allow, explicitly accepting higher levels of technical or integration risk in exchange for speed and immediate operational feedback.
Learning by doing, essentially.
Exactly. The core idea is that units in contact with the changing operational environment provide rapid bottom-up feedback on these newly fielded capabilities. That real-world experience then directly informs and helps validate the next iteration of deliberate requirements, which can then be documented more formally through the full Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System process.
So it's trying to create a faster loop between operational need and institutional response.
Yes, acknowledging that in a rapidly changing world, we can't always afford to wait years for the perfect, fully vetted solution. We have to adapt while engaged.
What an incredibly complex, interconnected system. Let me try to summarize the flow. High-level strategic guidance informs the requirements process, the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System.
Right, defining the need.
Those requirements then shape the force design updates, creating tables of organization and equipment,
Designing the organizational solution.
which then have to compete, often brutally, for finite resources within total Army analysis and the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system, resulting in authorized, modified tables of organization and equipment.
Resourcing the solution. The reality check.
And finally, all those approved changes are carefully synchronized and executed through force integration, using tools like the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List and the regionally aligned readiness and modernization model to manage the process.
Bringing it all together in the field. That's the essence of the choreography.
So why should our listener, likely a major or lieutenant colonel, care deeply about all this seemingly high-level institutional plumbing?
Because force management is absolutely not just a job for people working in the Pentagon or at Training and Doctrine Command headquarters. Every single field-grade officer, at some point in their career, will either be directly affected by the outputs of this system or, more likely, will be involved in some part of it.
Even if they aren't in a dedicated force management role.
Especially then. You might be asked to help define requirements for your unit type. You might be tasked with writing or staffing a doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership and education, personnel, facilities, and policy change requests to fix a problem you identified. You might have to justify resource requests for your section or unit, implicitly making a case within the Total Army Analysis or PPBE framework. You might be executing a force integration plan on the ground.
So understanding the mechanics is essential for professional effectiveness.
It's a critical requirement. Knowing who owns the decision space for different types of changes, understanding what a viable bill-payer strategy looks like, knowing how your unit's priority gets set via the dynamic Army resource priority list, this isn't just background noise. It's fundamental knowledge for navigating your career and advocating effectively for your soldiers and mission.
Looking at the whole system, it seems designed, fundamentally, to wrestle with one central, incredibly difficult trade-off. That tension between preparing for tomorrow and being ready today.
That is the absolute core dilemma. It permeates every single decision within force management. Given that resources, time, money, people are always finite and threats are complex and evolving, where do you place your bets? Where does the greatest risk truly lie?
Do you invest heavily in maintaining near-perfect readiness now, ensuring you can meet today's known operational demands with maximum capability?
Or do you accept some calculated short-term risk in current readiness? Maybe you underman some units slightly or defer an upgrade cycle in order to free up resources to invest in a potentially game-changing but maybe unproven future capability. That high-risk, high-reward technology or concept that might take a decade to mature but could be absolutely essential for survival in a future peer-level conflict.
That is the fundamental resource allocation problem.
It is. How do you balance readiness for today against modernization for tomorrow? There's no easy answer. The entire force management system, with all its complexity analysis and competing equities, is designed to provide the framework and the data to help senior leaders make the best possible judgments on that critical question. And navigating that requires sound military judgment and input at every single level of the process.
That really puts the entire system into perspective. It's not just bureaucracy, it's the mechanism for making the Army's highest stakes decisions. Thank you for walking us through that incredibly complex landscape.
My pleasure. It's a lot to digest, but hopefully this gives everyone a solid conceptual map.
I think it does. And thank you, our listeners, for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.